So with the end of the year upon us, I wanted to revisit what we do at the end of every single year, and that is looking at some of the top watches that we covered throughout the year on this channel. So how this is going to work is I'm gonna be going through several different categories, things like best dress watches, the top GMT watches for the year, because this was a strong year for GMTs, Microbrands, watches that disappointed me. Then also talking about some of my personal favorites, get rid of just what I think maybe you guys might like, but what I just got really excited about when I covered watches this year. So how this works, every single one of the watches that we actually are gonna feature in this video were also watches that we did more of an in-depth review on or coverage of to some capacity throughout the year. So it's not something that was just released this year, it's more of just what did we cover, get just a further understanding on. That is what qualifies it to be included in a video like this. And only watches that we've included for like the first time this year. So I don't wanna be showcasing something like the Tissot PRX that we covered last year and other watches that I've covered in the past extensively. I wanted this to kind of be a clean slate looking at 2022 and what we've covered ultimately this year. And also as we go through this, each category is going to have its own kind of range of products. So we'll have a low, medium, and high, so we can represent all the different price ranges as we're kind of recapping the year here. And also we do have a cool promo going on at teddybaldassarre.com. So anybody that purchases from our site from now until the end of the year, you will get invited to a private live stream where I will be hanging out, answering some questions, doing more of a Q&A, but also in addition to that, be showcasing and allowing some of my great team members to speak about topics that they're experts in. Will Bethune, who's our head of photography and video, giving some pointers about how to shoot watches. Also, we have our video content manager, Ben, who was previously a commercial diver. So he'll talk about the myths of dive watches in the industry, what's real, what's just marketing jargon. And then also Mark Bernardo, a watch journalist who leads our editorial department, written content on teddybaldassarre.com, who has literally written a book on pilot watches called Airtime. He'll be talking more about his expertise and just understanding the history and importance of pilot watches in the industry. So if that sounds interesting, definitely check it out, teddybaldassarre.com. Great way to also offer up a great gift to somebody you love, or maybe gift yourself this holiday season. We have over 30 brands. Definitely check it out and get an exclusive invite to that live stream. So to kick off our video here, we have the GMT category. And I was just kind of claiming that 2022 was unofficially the year of the GMT. You just look across the entire industry what was released, from Rolex to entry-level models. Everybody was throwing their hat into the ring this year, and you saw some great developments when it came to GMTs. One that I think certainly needs to be mentioned on the low end as the standout. This is one that I have described as being a knockout, complete home run, knock out of the park. That is the Seiko 5 GMT. So the SSK 001, 003, and 005. These watches are simply phenomenal. I talked about these being, when a baseball player just hits the ball, it makes contact, it goes off the bat, it's gone. Flip the bat. This is kind of how I think Seiko must have felt in the design department when they were able to roll these out. These are just phenomenal watches. Under $500, 42.5 millimeter case. So wearing like traditional SKX, but you're not really getting much more in the thickness department, despite getting a mechanical GMT movement on the inside. 46 millimeter lug to lug. These wear closer to, I'd say, a 40.5 on wrist. 100 meters of water resistance for our series of movements on the inside. But the big thing here is this has just changed the playing field when it comes to affordable GMT watches from a mechanical perspective, and these are now, I would say, leaders in that department. Talking about under $500 for a mechanical GMT. Seiko Instruments, at least at the time of recording this video, has not mentioned that that movement is going to be readily available just yet, but I think it's only a matter of time before this completely opens up to a marketplace. But for the time being, these were absolute just home runs for Seiko this year in 2022, and probably the winner in the low category, more affordable category for GMTs this year. Now for this next tier here, we're kind of more in that medium range. We're gonna be looking at the Longines Zulu Time. When these watches were unveiled, I knew that these were going to be very interesting for the market. For a long time, we were talking about a true GMT movement in this price range. The Black Bay GMT was it, and that watch retails over $4,000 on a bracelet. This comes in at under $3,000 on a strap, just above $3,000 on a bracelet, with a watch across the board that pretty much hangs with that Black Bay GMT. Take more of an aviation style, moving away from the Rolex GMT Master and shifting more into the aviation Flieger style roots that Longines certainly has their own reputation in developing. Add a true GMT caliber, some nice bezel options, and you basically just get I would say, one of the better releases of this year in this price range. 42 millimeter case, 13.9 millimeter thickness, so that is significantly thinner than, say, the Black Black Bay GMT and the Black Bay Pro, which was a big criticism for that watch when it was unveiled. Lug to lug is longer at 49.3 millimeters, but I'd say this one wears rather true to size, if not slightly smaller. Not a small watch by any means. Also getting 100 meters of water resistance and a proprietary movement produced for Longines by ETA. So some brands might call this in-house. Some brands, like Longines, are just kind of saying it's more of a proprietary movement, which regardless of how you look at it, phenomenal movement, and sapphire crystal, ceramic inserts across those different variations. This is just a winner, and I think it opened up kind of the floodgates for just new competition in the price range. To me, this I think was a bigger release because it came out of nowhere. We've already seen a ton of Black Bays in the past with just their GMT lineup. I think the Pro was very cool. Somebody likes the Explorer 2, but I gave this one a slight edge. And I actually have a review looking at both of these watches, going through the pros and cons of both of them. I actually think the GMT from Black Bay actually got a slight edge from the points department, but it really was a toss-up. So I'd recommend checking out that video down below. Now from the luxury category, we have a watch that I don't believe received the amount of praise it probably should have, and that is with the Grand Seiko SBGE 285. This is a watch when I was able to go and see the new novelties for Grand Seiko this year. I just looked at this immediately. And sometimes when I look at watches, of course I try to think about the market at large, but then I also think about my own personal taste. And this was one where for my personal taste, I really fell in love with it. I was enamored immediately when I saw this watch. A few reasons why. Number one, case size, 41 millimeters, lug to lug of 47.4 millimeters. From a spring drive GMT perspective, of course, Grand Seiko has some other mechanical GMT options that are pretty wearable, but from a sports model lineup, this is probably the most compact spring drive GMT you're going to come across, especially with a package that also looks the part. Simply love the way this one looks. 100 meters of water resistance. Of course, looking inspired by the Rolex Explorer 2 with its fixed outer bezel with its 24-hour scale, but spring drive movement on the inside. And this was also unveiled alongside with a black dial version, but this white one, being referred to as the Mist, is the one to go for in my opinion, because it has this textured surface. If you like this style of dial, say with something like the Snowflake, maybe some of the Four Seasons collections, adapt that to a GMT, you get this fine texture. It's still subtle though, and not as crazy and eye-catching as some of their other dial textures. But this was one of my favorite releases of the year, and somehow it was just overshadowed by some other watches. You talk about Rolex, and even from Grand Seiko, the big talk of the show at Watches and Wonders was their Constant Force Escapement Tourbillon, which of course is simply phenomenal, but that's also a watch that costs as much as a house. This is something that more people can afford, and I think for myself was right in alignment with something that I'd want to see from a sports watch perspective from Grand Seiko. And I'm not gonna spend much time on this one. I just wanna mention it just because it did leave such an impression on me this year. Did not cover it extensively, but I'd love to do so in the future, and that is with Parmigiani's Tonda GMT Rattrapante. I saw this at Watches and Wonders, and I just thought it was cool. Maybe slightly gimmicky, but to me, I thought it was just phenomenal. I thought it was a really interesting way of just kind of catching attention. You basically have this hidden GMT hand on this watch that you can engage, hide, depending on if you're traveling or not. Crazy thin, incredibly wearable. This is one that left an impression, and when looking back at the year, one that I still can't fully quit. I would love to cover this one in more detail, and I would recommend you guys take a closer look at it because it is a pretty cool watch. Now for our next category, we have Microbrands, and the first one up is from a brand called Scurfa. This was a brand that was put on my radar by Ben. He's our content manager, as I mentioned in our introduction, talking about that live stream that we're doing later, or actually the start of next year. But he was a commercial diver. He knew of this other gentleman who started this company who is an actual saturation diver, and he started making some watches just for fun because he loves watches. He's a diver, and this was his creation, Scurfa. And this watch here is the Diver 1. It's a titanium watch, $230, wears like a 40 millimeter case watch, wears like a, say, a Tudor Submariner, vintage Tudor Submariner, but in titanium, grade 2, Swiss Ronda movement on the inside, sapphire crystal, actual helium escape valve that works. The guy who actually produces or leads this brand on the side, is kind of more of his like passion project, actually made these watches to really work and fit the standard that a true diver would need if they were going to rely on their dive watch in these environments. So $230, pretty much as simple as that. Is this watch recreating anything crazy unique? No, but is it value packed? Does it have a person behind it that knows the product category and I think has a passion for things? Absolutely. And when I can see those two things collide, I'm a fan. I remember handling this for the first time. I'm like, yeah, this is gonna work. This is gonna absolutely work. I really liked them. I wanted to cover them in the past, but they just didn't have any product. Seems like they now have product again, and this was one that with this blue just bezel dial combination, I just think looks very, very good. One of my favorite micros this year has to be Excelsior Park with the EP95004. Hate the name, but love the watch. This is more of a salmon style dial. I was at a event in Switzerland, Time to Watches. The founder just taps his shoulder, says, hey, you're Teddy Baldassarre. Can I show you some of my watches? Same founder as Nevada Grenshin, Vulcane, but this was the one out of all of the watches that he showed me where I'm like, wait, how have I never seen this before? This is a great looking watch. I think it has the sizing knocked down. It's got the vintage heritage style just to a T. I love the dial color, and also the price was under $2,000 for a Swiss-made mechanical chronograph, fully integrated mechanical chronograph movement. 39 millimeter case, 13.1 millimeter thickness, considering many of the other just places from Swatch Group and elsewhere, you're talking about 14 millimeters plus for many mechanical Swiss chronographs. He was able to get around this with some work within the case, but also with the manual SW510 inside. Sapphire crystal with some crystal distortion of the markers, which adds more to the vintage charm, and somehow 100 meters of water resistance. And it looks beautiful. It's not just a spec junkie. It's got some cool just tie-in with its history with this brand. He of course just, resurged the brand, just revitalized it. That's kind of his whole thing. But I thought it was a great look. One of the watches that was a surprise of this year from the micro perspective, without question. So the micro category didn't follow the same flow with the low, medium, high, but I think it's still okay. The last one here is Autodromo with the Valley Lunga. I remember when we were doing this Microbrand video, and of course, Autodromo, they've been around for over a decade. They've been well established in the microsphere, a lot of automotive influence in terms of what they're doing, and I think it's very authentic influence. It's not something that just feels forced. You ever feel those collaborations and those design identities where it's just based on like this idea and it just feels like it's pandering? This does not come off in that way. It's very authentic in terms of when I'm handling the products. There's something about it that just feels like it's just passion. When I can feel passion, that's great. This was the one though that made, for me, when I put it on the wrist, I just felt something. 40 millimeter case, thickness of 12 millimeters. You're getting a Miyota movement on the inside, the 8315. So this is their 8 series of calibers. It is hacking movement, but all in all, I just love the design of these. There was just something about them. I just put it on the wrist and I'm like, it's different. It just feels like a speedometer of like a cool vintage car. And I'm not even a car guy, but I just got it. It just felt like I was getting in my Italian sports car when I put this thing on. Just simple as that. Sometimes you don't need to have the best just way to describe your feelings about something, but if you feel some way, I think that's all that really matters. And I did with these Autodromo pieces, a brand that certainly has been around for some time, but one I think, again, that deserves its kudos. So now for our everyday category, and to kick us off here with the low end or the lower end, and I think this is still kind of getting up there to start, but still under $1,000, Hamilton Khaki Field Titanium. So titanium was the material choice of the last 12 months for Hamilton. We did see the bronze option, but that was more of a previous year release. This is more true definitive 2022, and I like these products a lot. You saw some more funky dials with their concrete dial, but to me, I like the green and the black dial the most. They're more conventional, to the point. And one thing that I liked when combining the initial Khaki Field DNA with these watches is the Khaki Field mechanical and some of those other variations were always so lightweight on the wrist. This just takes it another level. There's been many times where you put one of these watches on a NATO strap and you're like, okay, I forgot I even had this on. With the titaniums, it's even furthered. Also getting 100 meters of water resistance. In addition, thickness is still under control at 11.8 millimeters, 38 millimeter case. Lug to lug, I would say, is going to be farther out, but wears like I'd say a 39 on wrist. 80-hour power reserve, sapphire crystal on top. The only thing I would say about these watches that I don't like as much is the straps that come with them. I don't like the double prong buckles on them, but otherwise I think these are great looking pieces. They do the job, they're lightweight, and from a everyday titanium watch perspective under $1,000, Swiss made, it just checks off the boxes. These are no nonsense, and that's part of the DNA and why so many people love the Hamilton Khaki Field collection to begin with. So since we have shot this video, Hamilton released the Khaki Murph at 38 millimeters, and I just wanted to put this clip in here to acknowledge the fact that I think it's awesome, and probably if I would have waited maybe an additional week or so, that this would have been the watch that I would have included in this segment. So I just want to mention it before maybe people start leaving comments about, hey, how did you forget about this? I certainly would have if I would have known this was coming. For our second tier here in the everyday category, we have the Longines Spirit 37 millimeter. Now the Spirit, when they were first unveiled, great looking watches, but the #1 challenge for so many people out there was just how the lugs extended out so far. The end links also were extending out even further. So from a practicality standpoint, the watches were 2 to 3 millimeters larger than what the case size would indicate. These new 37s answer those criticisms completely. 37 millimeters, so going to wear pretty true to that size, probably a bit larger at 38 millimeters with the 44.9 millimeter lug to lug. But the great thing about this, in addition to that, is they also made an adjustment to how those end links are going to sit and shoot further down to the wrist, making it wear more compact than you might expect. COSC certified movement, 100 meters of water resistance, sapphire crystal, variety of dial colors to choose from, and the bracelet on these is also well done. You saw the Tudor Ranger that was released this year. Again, I think I would give the edge to this because if you look down the pecking order of features, and I would say this one is not as close compared to the Tudor Ranger. I can actually do a full review looking at these two watches, but you're getting a COSC certified movement, wearable case, and coming in at a price range closer in that $2,000 to $2,500 price range. This is that extension up from, say, looking at the Hamilton Khaki Field and doing it with a bit more refinement. That's how I would look at these pieces. So now this next watch, I don't believe has even hit store shelves yet. We're still waiting on retailers to actually get these pieces. It may have started to progress a bit more since maybe recording this video, but it seems very slow to get into stores with these watches. And they were unveiled maybe like in February. But this is the Omega Aquaterra 38 millimeter, specifically the terracotta dial. This is, to me, one of my favorite dials of the year. It has to be in the running. And at 38 millimeters, they made some adjustments. I love the Aquaterra in 38. Aquaterra is more that mass appealing Oyster Perpetual alternative. And as you saw with the release of these, and I think Omega understood that as well if you looked at the different color array that they offered up. 5 at 38 millimeters, 5 at 34 millimeters. I just love this terracotta version. Having a different process for creating the dial here, it just popped the most with the AR coating on it. It's just one of those watches that when you see it on the wrist, you know, it just works really well for me. It might not work well for everybody. It does make a statement. You're talking about a $6,000 watch. Some people were critical of the date window, which I understand. I don't mind it at 6 o'clock. But maybe I would say that it would look better without it. But the dial itself, spectacular. I just love the way this one looked. And then for one stretch pick, I'll just throw it in here, and that is the Vacheron Constantin Historique 222. The 222, some people were, dogging this watch, saying it looked like an affordable PRX. But I promise you, as somebody who's handled probably more PRXs than almost anybody on the planet, this is not a PRX. This is an absolute knockout watch. The history of Vacheron, 1977. This was their kind of entry door into the world of integrated sports watches, following the Nautilus in 75 and the Royal Oak 3 years earlier. Case size here, 37 millimeters, going to wear, I would say, almost 2 millimeters larger than that at 39, but coming in this gold case, but thin at that 7.95 millimeters. VC 2455-2 movement on the inside. And they had this watch directly with a 1970s version, and they looked as if they were identical. It was hard at times, unless you started to do a double take and you got more comfortable, or maybe flip the watch around and were able to see the difference, that these were two different watches. They did a very nice job in recreating the feeling of the 222 from a modern watchmaking perspective. All right, so now let's get into the most unique category. And by unique, I'm looking at something that was able to separate from the crowd given the price range that it occupies, or at least maybe reinvent how we look at a conventional watch. The first one that I'll throw in here will be the Brew Metric. This is the reason why I'm gonna throw this in here is, sure, there's some inspiration from certain places, but you look at the microbrand space and so much of it is, of course, recreating something that we've seen in the past and doing it in a more affordable perspective. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, as long as you make your own touches and can create your own identity to some degree. But I think Brew does it with a little bit more of its differentiating take. And why I think it's hard to do this, because you're talking about prices for Brew watches that are under $500. It's hard to reinvent not reinvent the wheel, but to even make significant changes than what we normally see in the price range when you are just so limited by the price in which you're trying to occupy for your end MSRP. But they do this pretty well. 36 millimeter case, 10.75 millimeters with the thickness, with a chronograph movement on the inside, getting a Seiko quartz movement with the VK68 sapphire crystal. Pretty wearable lug to lug. You have somewhat of this integrated look and design, unconventional colorway. These are watches that I've just seen out and about. It's just crazy, these watches, how they've just caught on, but I get why, because if you're looking at the market of under $500, what is maybe one of the more unique looking pieces, I would say this has to be in the running. So for this next one, you might be saying, it looks exactly like an Apple Watch. How could this be seen as unique? Well, I would just say that this is the coolest way of going about trolling something I've ever seen from the watchmaking industry, just because you have a sense of humor and how you're able to go about, sending a joke. Because this watch really, at the end of the day, is kind of a joke, and what Moser was going for. That is the Swiss Alp Final Upgrade. This was a watch, I didn't know how people were going to receive it, but it seemed like people understood the concept and were able to think it was pretty interesting. 38.2 millimeter case, but it does not wear like that. I would say with those wired lugs, it's gonna wear like a 42, 43 on the wrist. But what made this watch, of course, unique was it addressed the elephant in the room that is the Apple Watch, and did it from a high-end watchmaking perspective. I mean, this is a high horology movement on the flip side, multiple day power reserve with the power reserve indicator, well finished, making their own components and hairsprings. You have the Vanta Black dial, which is essentially the most dark material that you're going to find in the world, and that loading second hand to go along with it that reminds us of when our tech is not cooperating fully and we get impatient. At first inspection, maybe not that unique, but I just think the exercise of going at the antithesis of what mechanical watchmaking is, and that's the Apple Watch, how these two things can collide and do it in a way that still makes sense, and still I think both sides of the aisle can be like, hey, all right, kudos to them. I think that's pretty unique and a job well done. And then for our final watch in the unique category, we have the Resonance Type 3 BB. This was a watch, I also had no idea what people would think of this one just because it is so out there. It looks like what we were talking about earlier, more of like a wearable piece of tech than it does a wristwatch, but this is very much a crazy feat of engineering. This piece is broken up into different compartments. The winding of the watch will be handled on the back side. The setting of the watch will be handled on the case back. And then inside the watch, what's allowing this watch to have such this clean, reflective, visible view on the front is going to be the use of oil inside. So you're talking about like a third of a shot glass full of oil that's in this watch. So that is what's creating this look and feel. I am not gonna be able to get into all the details on how it works. So I'd recommend checking out my video where I describe a bit more about this timepiece. The watch is $40,000. So just warning you now, if you're getting ready to go and say, oh, I'm ready to pick one of these up, just be warned. But even with that being said, it is one to still investigate. I like covering watches regardless of whether or not I can afford them or if I'm interested in them. I just think I'm looking at things that are able to differentiate themselves from the very busy world of watchmaking. And when something can separate itself, let your curiosity go wild and figure out how this thing works. It's a pretty cool one. Now moving into dive watches, I was conflicted on which one to mention in this video. You could look at Citizen with the Fugu models, which I think were great releases, but I decided to go with the SPB 143. Now this is extending above $1,000, so to say that this is low is not what I want to get across. This is still a good chunk of change, but just relatively speaking on what was covered this year, this one did fall in a range where I think I could still at least maybe package it here. And I didn't cover, and I don't think there were really a ton of great affordable dive watches that were released this year. I think the staples remained the staples. There was nothing incredibly new that came to the forefront that we covered. But this was one that, of course, has been out there for a while. I really do enjoy it though. The SPB 143 is one of the watches from Seiko. They get a lot of hate when it comes to watches above $1,000. This was the first one that I was able to handle where I'm like, okay, this really is among the best in the price range. I think this one is absolutely worth the money and well positioned. The case wears like a dream, 40.5 millimeters, lug to lug of 47.6 millimeters, wears like a true 40, if not smaller if you put it on a NATO strap, 200 meters of water resistance, good lume, some different dial options to choose from. SPB 143 is kind of that staple, mass market, 1960s, 70s diver from Seiko that just has a lot of charm. This was my choice. Moving to the next tier of dive watches, I'm gonna look at the Tudor Pelagos 39. This was my favorite release from Tudor this year. At the time of Watches and Wonders, I thought it was going to be the Black Bay Pro GMT, but this was the one at the end of the year that I think stands out the most. The Pelagos 39, or just the smaller version of the Pelagos, was something I have been waiting for a while. I would have preferred a blue dial for my own personal taste, but the black dial absolutely is a great option. How I tend to describe this watch is, sure, it's a modern creation, but if you look back to those vintage Tudor Submariners that were being produced for the Marine Nationale, if you took that ethos and created a modern watch, I think the Pelagos line is more in alignment with that DNA than many of the Black Bays, just because they were so much more about the spec and doing the job. That is what more of the Pelagos is about. Now, some people might not like the fact that they cut the water resistance down, the rehaut is gone, helium escape valve is gone. It does lose a bit of its identity with some of the more utilitarian types of ideas that it had, but still, all in all, I think it's still a phenomenal release from Tudor. I'd say it's their best release since the Black Bay Chrono at 2021. In terms of just mass market appeal, this is going to certainly take some of the market share away from the Black Bay 58 and some other Black Bay models, but quite frankly, I do think that Tudor was maybe heavily reliant on the Black Bay. I think it's good that they have another pillar that they can start to rely on, and I hope to see more Pelagos models to come in the future, but this was certainly a hit this year from Tudor. Now next, for our higher end tier, we have the Omega Seamaster Diver 300 meter. This is a watch that I would probably consider as maybe being outside of something like the Speedmaster, maybe the Black Bay, being a definitive starter luxury watch that you can buy. It just checks off the boxes. You have the Pierce Brosnan connection, James Bond connection. It's become the watch over the last 25, 30 years from Omega that is right alongside with the Speedmaster, is almost becoming equally as iconic. Its silhouette is undeniable and recognizable from across the room. Although I personally like the Seamaster 300 a bit more in terms of its retro styling, I totally get the charm of this piece, and it is so well positioned within the market at just around $5,000. I talked about why this watch is so important to Omega and why it is probably so beloved by so many. I'd recommend checking out my video taking a closer look at this watch, but there's no question about the impact. There's no question about its value and position in the marketplace. And the wave dial is simply entrancing, great reliable movement on the inside. There also is the new green dial version released this year, so plenty to get lost in, a true staple in the world of luxury watches. So now moving into watches that underwhelm me. These are not necessarily bad watches, but I think expectations, are really the way to indicate happiness in many ways. If you have higher expectations, it could leave you disappointed at the end of it. But the first one here is the Swatch Omega, the Moon Swatch. This was a watch that, not because of the watch itself, I think if you had unrealistic expectations expecting this to be a Speedmaster, well, yeah, the end product's gonna be trash and compared to what you're going to ultimately want. But if you understood that this was a Swatch, which it absolutely is, then I don't think the disappointment comes in the actual product. I think it comes in the expectations set by availability. When these were first unveiled, I don't know if they fully grasped how big of a release this was. I think this had the opportunity to be the all-encompassing watch that could get people into the hobby, it could get people talking. You look at the Google search results for this watch and it just skyrocketed. This was the release of the year in so many ways of just pop culture relevance. It made watches the center of attention in so many different mediums and forums. But then the release and rollout of this watch just had speed bump after speed bump after speed bump. They first talking about it being available online, then it doesn't come available online. Then you had some of the issues with some of the different colored cases and what was going on there. That was as much of a big deal because it is a Swatch at the end of the day. What I was really more, I think, disappointed in is the fact that I don't think the opportunity that was in front of this release was fully met. If they were able to just setting expectations the proper way, being able to give people good communication on availability when they're coming, also just giving just more transparency behind the release, that would have just, I think, made this all in all better. There's still some hype with these pieces, but compared to where it was, things have died down. I still think they're cool watches. Would I own one eventually? Yeah, probably, but I'm not waiting in a line to do it. They've done some other things recently with actually driving around some Fiats and selling the watches out of that, which is actually a cool idea. That would have been probably better received at the beginning compared to after the fact, where we've seen all of the things unfold that we have. So that's all I'll say about the Omega Swatch. I don't think it's necessarily a bad watch, it's just the release and execution could have been much better. I think that the release though, and if you looked at one of my videos earlier this year, I talked about it was like a stroke of genius in many ways, and I think I still stand by that. Just the execution of releasing the watch wasn't the same thing as what the watch represented at the time of release. And for another watch that disappointed me this year, and it was one because I was very excited when I saw the press releases for them. Again, not necessarily bad watches, they just didn't reach what I would have ultimately wanted, and that was the Citizen Challenge Diver in titanium. These are really cool looking watches. I thought this was probably one of the best looking Citizen Divers, even better looking than the Fugu models, because the Fugu models to me just have this, the markers, and it's just dial design sometimes might not just be for everybody. I understand they're more for the diver, like the true diver, and legibility in mind. But these are more my speed. I think they just look a little more pleasing for the casual type of wearing experience. But when you handle them in person, the problem was I just didn't feel the jump in quality compared to some of their entry-level offerings. And then also considering that this is getting closer to the SPB 143, I don't know if it really stacked up. I also think of something like Mito with their Ocean Stars, Certina and what they're offering up. Just the finishing, the fit and finish of what is being offered. When you jump up in price, of course you are demanding more dollars, but you're also now getting in a range where the demand for a consumer and their options are also going to be higher. I like how there's a Miyota 9 series in here. I think the design looks great, but there was just some of the details that just felt as if it was more of an entry-level Citizen rather than it was more this higher elevated feel. If this watch was closer to, say, the $700, $600 range, I think it'd be a different equation. I just felt it was just a bit of a stretch and just not quite there in the details compared to where I wanted it to be. Still a good watch, and I don't fault anybody for wanting to look at buying one of these watches because I do think they're well put together. Citizen, all in all, is overlooked by many, but it could have been, I think, much, much more if they just were able to fine tune some of the details. Now moving into Chronograph, for our low here, we have the Seiko Prospex Solar Speed Timer. You want a Daytona with its looks, and you want it to be more wearable, and you don't want to spend over $1,000. Actually, you don't even want to spend over $700. Well, bring in the Speed Timer. Speed Timer to me, it's just a no-brainer. It's just from a Japanese watchmaking perspective, maybe the best chronograph you're going to find under $700. Of course, there's some other good offerings out there, but if you want wearability and you also want the upside of a quartz solar movement on the inside with some sweeping secondhand action, well, this is one that you're probably gonna have to look at. 100 meters of water resistance. It wears like a 39 on the wrist, which is crazy. It looks kind of like a Daytona, but it has its own feel. And also, I think many people sleep on the fact that when looking at mechanical chronographs, Seiko, when it comes to automatic production, has a history just as good as any with the 6139 and what they were doing the late 1960s and 70s. Moving up to the next tier with chronographs. Now, last year was very much the year of the Tissot PRX and its takeover of the affordable watch market. This year, there was a new release, and that was with a chronograph, the Tissot PRX chronograph. They also had another release with their 1938 telemeter model, but that watch, I don't think quite as much caught on like the PRX Chrono. The PRX Chrono just came out of nowhere. Even though we saw, of course, the success of the PRX, I just remember seeing this watch for the first time, like, oh, they did. Why didn't I think of that? It's such a good idea. They should totally do that. And they did it, and it worked out. The only thing that people were critical of this watch was just the actual size of it. It's 42 millimeters, and it wears like a 42.5 to 43. So it is not a small watch. But if you are someone that wants that integrated sports chronograph look, under $2,000 and getting a Swiss mechanical chronograph at $1,750, this is probably the most attainable one you're going to come by at retail pricing. Sapphire crystal, the blue dial is great. You have more of that panda dial option with the gold tones. You have some good choices here, and this was one in the busy year, as for Tissot especially, that was one of the staples and standouts for the calendar year of 2022. So Breitling as a brand, say 15 years ago, had a certain reputation in terms of their design style. Big, and if it can be bigger, make it bigger. But now it is much different with George Kern involved in the head of the brand and now kind of reimagining some of their designs. In the last 5 years, they produced some beautiful watches, and maybe at the top in terms of my favorite piece has to be this Breitling Premier B09. This watch is just beautiful. I love this watch, and it's like the watch that you would never expect Breitling to make. If you showed somebody in 2010, like, hey, check out this Breitling, they'd be like, what is going on? What is this? Or did Breitling look back to the 1960s? Is this a 1960s release, or is this contemporary? Now it's a totally different world in which we live in and what enthusiasts want to see, but this is a great looking watch. Simply put, the green dial, they call it pistachio green, is unlike any other shade of green you're going to come across. I did a video with Kevin O'Leary. We were doing a shopping episode. And this was one where he just kind of glanced past it, and I remember just seeing, just shut my mouth. I just like, okay, I'm not gonna let him say anything. I'm gonna come back to this later, and I did. And then he ended up stealing it in our shopping episode, which I was really upset about, but I did wanna cover this one in more detail because it is a beautiful looking timepiece, wonderful symmetry, manual Breitling B09 movement on the inside, which also shades off some of the thickness of the B01, 47.3 millimeters for the lug to lug, so it wears like a true 40, if not smaller on wrist. You could also mention the Navitimer as for the 41 millimeter options being right there. But this one just slightly more. I just like the design of this. It's less busy, more middle 20th century dress chronograph vibes. I just adore this watch. It's simply beautiful. And then for the stretch, I'll just mention this one quickly, the Lange Datograph Perpetual. You're talking well into the 6 figures here for a watch. Take the Datograph, the L951, this is the L952 here, getting the perpetual functions for this timepiece. Still though, in terms of a feast for the eyes, that is this movement. The back of this watch looks even better than the front, but how Lange is able to take one conventional design and DNA and then build upon it with different complications. This is a great example of them doing that in a master class of a way. Looked at a few different Lange watches throughout the year, but this was the high complication, the crazier one that we looked at, and one that still leaves an impression. This is an older generation of the Datograph Perpetual, but still one that, simply put, remarkable. Now for dress watches, moving into the low end, we're going to give the win to the Orient Bambino 38. You know when you see comments on YouTube videos where people are saying, or just in forums, like, oh, they need to make this, they need to change this about the watch, it would be better if it was this. What if a brand just took all those comments and actually did every single one of them? It took them a while to do it, but that's what the Orient Bambino 38 is. They made it a smaller case after it being larger at 40 millimeters, even number lug width as well. The only thing they didn't do was make a sapphire crystal, but this watch still is $250. So of course sapphire would have been great, but they also like that more domed effect with the crystal. Simply put, this watch is just answering all the concerns over the last decade with the Bambino, or at least just some of the downsides. Not even really concerns, because the Bambino has been, of course, that affordable staple for many, many years. But this answered many of the criticisms for its size, made it better in many ways for at least those people that were requesting those things, and it's just great to finally see the 38 now come out in the market. For our next here, we have the Junghans Meister Calendar Moon, a watch that, to be honest, I did not fully appreciate until I spent some time covering with a review. It's just a beautiful watch. It has a calendar function, $2,300, 40.4 millimeter case, conventional Junghans style, which is rather unconventional, very minimalistic, very much about the point. It does have this Germanic effect to it with that infused idea of Bauhaus principles. And it comes together with a really clean looking dial. And also from a positioning standpoint, you're talking about just over $2,000 to get a full calendar watch with this Germanic style that I think many people love. I don't know if enough people know about this watch or have considered it, but it's one to maybe investigate a little bit further. I remember when trying to put this video together, I was thinking about all the watches to consider, and this one almost slipped through the cracks, and that's part of what this watch is. It just slips through the cracks. You just take a closer look if you haven't yet. And now for the high-end tier for dress watches, this is the only tie on this entire video. I did this entire video and I made a definitive choice for every single one of these. But I couldn't do it as hard as I tried for these watches because I love both of them. One being the Lange 1 and one being the Breguet Tradition 7097. Both of these watches are simply fantastic. I adore them for different reasons. The Lange 1 just because it epitomizes high-end watchmaking from a dress watch perspective from Germany. It's a master of asymmetrical elements, but still makes everything feel so whole and cohesive. It's this imposing idea of asymmetry, but still feeling balanced. No other watch comes close to matching that in the entire watchmaking industry like this one. Some might not like it, but those that understand the history, those that do have an appreciation for German watchmaking, I know will adore this watch. And then for the other watch, we have Breguet. And this year, I wanted to cover Breguet more simply because I think people sleep on Breguet too much. How a brand like that could become underrated is crazy to me, but it is actually the case if you look at modern Breguet. Their watches are timeless, they're well finished, they're well done. Many of the elements that we commonly associate with high horology watchmaking was because of Breguet. And the Tradition is a combination of infusing the classic pocket watch design into a wristwatch, Originally, this design was created with the pocket watch where the hatch would show that smaller dial, and the elements of the gear train would then become available when you would open up your pocket watch and see the internal components. Now, this is adapted to a traditional wristwatch, paying honor to those early pocket watches, but why this watch to me feels so cool is because it's not necessarily crazy complex considering what it is and where it's positioned. This watch is less expensive than the Lange 1. And if you just look at the dial, you're like, how is that possible? But on paper, outside of the retrograde second hand, which is really visually entrancing, there's all that anticipation to see it jump back after every 60 seconds. It is more of a conventional time-only watch with the gear train just being fully exposed at the bottom portion of the dial or the open part of the case. There was a time earlier this year where you had a choice. You can go for a Rolex Daytona as a pre-owned price, or you can buy one of these at retail and then also have an additional $10,000 left over to do what you want with it. So that, I think, goes to show why this watch is so overlooked. And if you look at it, it's just simply beautiful. So now just to conclude, just look at 10 watches that, for my own personal taste, I love this year that were released. This is just my subjective opinion now. I'm just talking about watches that I would personally like to own or now do own. The Omega Aquaterra Terracotta has to be on the list. Love that red dial. Grand Seiko SBGE 285, a total slept on GMT this year, one of my favorites. Then moving into the Breitling B09, the green dial. It's not a conventional Breitling, but in the last 5 to 10 years, easily one of my favorite releases from the brand without question. I would totally own one of these in a second. Let's throw these Seiko 5 GMTs in there. These are just amazing. I love these watches. It just has now changed the game for GMTs at the more affordable perspective. I honestly want all three. So they're just great. That's simply put. I love how now or some more attainable GMT watches. If this was something that I knew was available when I was first getting into watches, oh my God, I would have been going crazy. I would have bought one of these in a second. In addition, we have the Breguet Tradition 7097. I talked about why I just think this watch is so special just a moment ago. It just is so unique. It's undervalued, and I think more people need to wake up to Breguet. Same for Lange 1. The Lange 1, from a German watchmaking perspective, is just the epitome of doing it to a master degree. Then we have the Longines Spirit 37mm. I always liked the Spirit design. I liked the way that they were positioned in the market around that $2,000 to $2,500 price range, but the case sizes were too large. The 37 now makes this a perfect fit on my wrist. It just looked amazing when strapped on. Then moving into the Autodromo Vallelunga. This is a watch, like I mentioned, it's not necessarily anything that is going to wow you from the spec department, but if a watch can make you feel something and it can transport you into a certain type of feeling, that's all that matters. And that watch did it for me. I just remember seeing it on, when we got them, we're reviewing them, and I'm like, oh, man, these are cool. I don't know what it is. I just feel like I'm in an Italian sports car right now, and I want to go fast. That's all I felt when I was wearing those watches. The Vacheron 222, one of my favorite releases at Watches and Wonders. Vacheron, a brand that's of course close to my heart, and this is one that to me, it just gets back to their roots, and is a great answer. Nobody expected it, but I'm so glad they did it. And then finally, we have the FP Journe Repetition Souverain. This was a watch that I really didn't have any experience handling until this year. I did a full interview with Laurent, Francois Paul's brother of FP Journe, and I was just blown away by this watch. How thin it was. I've never held a minute repeater from a contemporary perspective that wears like this, in stainless steel. It's thin, sapphire dial as well. You think about those smaller components like the recess area for the sub-seconds and the hammer. It was crazy how they were able to actually pull this thing off, and it's remarkably thin. You don't even feel it on the wrist, and when you have it on the wrist, it will use your back of your wrist as a way to project sound even more. If you haven't seen the video where we covered this watch in more detail, I'd recommend checking it out. Not gonna be something that I'm gonna be owning anytime soon, but still a complete marvel to look at. But all right, guys, that is it for this year for the top watches of 2022. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so we can keep this going every single year. If you enjoy when we do this, really would appreciate the encouragement as well. Also, thank you to all of you that have watched throughout the year. I know we have a few weeks left of the year, but I just want to thank you guys for allowing me to just do something I love on a day-to-day basis. I just can't really think of anything else I'd rather do, and you guys let me do that for a living. So thank you all for watching, whether you're liking the video, watching the video, it doesn't really even matter. You're buying on the site, it doesn't matter. It all supports what we're doing here, and I just greatly appreciate it. Thank you to all of you that do it. Happy holidays to all of you, and Happy New Year as well. But guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I will see you all very soon.